So I actually came to study this region, Russia and Eastern Europe, through theater, right? So I started out being interested in theater, and that brought me to this region. I always wanted to be an actor from the time I realized you had to have a job when you grew up. I actually really wanted to be a dancer, but my ballet teacher told me I was a little pudgy. So I turned to theater and was very lucky that my parents took me to theater a lot as a child. We went to a lot of outdoor Shakespeare festivals. So I was really exposed to a lot of theater at a young age and just really imagined myself being on that stage. And my favorite playwright was Anton Chekhov and Three Sestry, Chaika, Dядя Vanya. And I really believed if one were going to do the playwright justice, right, you really should learn the language of the playwright. So one of the many reasons I became a Russian major in college, actually, was to be able to do Chekhov, like, for real. And I actually did a study abroad at the Moscow Art Theater in 1995. That was a really amazing experience, sort of shattering in many ways, but it was really phenomenal, and I learned a lot about myself and theater history in Russia. Also, the mid-90s were a really interesting time in theater in Russia. Sort of picture mid-90s, right? So right after the collapse, right when there's a lot of experiment happening and sort of new styles of patronage happening in the arts, and we saw some really amazing theater productions. We went to the theater probably 3 or 4 times a week as part of the program that I was on at the Moscow Art Theater. And we were embedded with some of the Russian students. So we had some Russian teaching assistants in our program, and we were sort of used their classrooms, right, and their professors. And interestingly, this is a program that was run by the Eugene O'Neill Theater Institute in Connecticut. It was their semester abroad program at the Moscow Art Theater. It still exists, actually, and I went back a couple of years ago visiting my theater history professor, Anatoly Smilyansky, from the program, and now there's an American studio at the Moscow Art Theater. Like, they have their own dorm, and they have their own studio, right, and sort of all these facilities. So I was sort of back in the day, right, when there were fewer resources. So there are more resources. It's a very different program now, but it was really amazing to see all that theater there in the 90s in Russia. And one of the things that it really made me think about when I started my own acting career after college, right, where, I mean, let's face it, I'm like waiting tables, and I'm a caterer, and, you know, setting up the tables and serving food at all these bar and bat mitzvahs, right, in New York and New Jersey. And I was doing translation. I did a lot of Russian translation, I did some French translation, and was doing a lot of tutoring. So I have like 5 jobs, you know. I was on unemployment for a while, struggling to get auditions, and it really made me think about, right, these different relationships, that different roles and functions that artists have in different societies. And so I was really interested in, like, why is theater so important in Russia? Why does the state care so much, right? Why don't they have to be on unemployment, right? Why is it different there? And when my own acting career ended, or rather when I ended my own acting career, which is a whole other story, but I really wanted to go back to graduate school to figure out the answer to sort of that question, and figure out why theater was important in the Soviet Union, and what that meant. So I went back and I got my PhD in history, and wrote a dissertation on Soviet theater in Ukraine, and ended up writing this book, Beaumont on Empire's Edge, State and Stage in Soviet Ukraine, University of Toronto Press, 2017, available on Amazon. I love my book. So it explores sort of that question of What happens when a state makes artists really important? And what happens when that state is the Soviet state? And it turns out that actually a lot of good things happen, right? Like you get state support, you get the state controlling audiences, making incentives for people to go to the theater, right? You get massive financial support, right? A show can bomb, right? It can be terrible, but the state still gives them a budget, you know. Artists have apartments, right? They get vacations, right? They have status in society. So the state gives them a lot, but of course there's a cost for that, right? We are talking about the Soviet state, right? We are talking about a state that really is about control, and so yes, artists are arrested, right? And they are shot, and they are sent to the Gulag, and there are many tragic stories, right, of lives and talents and careers lost, right? But it's a very complex story, and so I was looking at that, and I was looking at that in Ukraine, which is sort of an accident. I actually wrote my first paper in graduate school on Soviet theater in Ukraine. Empire was a big theme. My advisor said, yeah, you should write on something outside Moscow. I was learning Polish at the time, so I thought, how hard could Ukrainian be? Turns out really hard. But I ended up writing this paper on Ukraine, and that became a summer grant, and then that became what I was doing, and I really loved Ukraine. I made a lot of friends really quickly, a lot of theater connections really quickly. It also seemed like a place where things were happening theatrically that were really interesting. And it's a multi-ethnic place, less so now than it was, but it was a place, there was a huge Yiddish theater community, there was a huge Polish theater community, Ukrainian, Russian, Armenian, Bulgarian, German theater at one point, right? And as an actor, it always felt like art can heal communities, that art can bridge differences, that a theater project can bring people together, and kind of build bridges, right, between communities. And what I found in the Soviet case was that was not always true, and that actually sort of state sponsorship of different individual theaters often built walls between them, and actually prevented cultural exchange more than building bridges. At the center of it is this theater director named Les Kurbas. His theater is called the Brazil, and they did really amazing work. And actually this fall I had the opportunity to go to Kiev, and a colleague of mine, Svetlana Tkach, who's amazing, had found the score to the first ever Ukrainian language vaudeville show, or sort of review show. And I wrote about it in my book as sort of Soviet popular culture and this attempt to create entertainment culture in the Soviet context. It's a show called Hello from Radio 477. And so she found the score to it, and had musicians actually play the score. And we were in this space called Arsenal, which is the former Arsenal factory, arms factory in Kiev. And there's this exhibit with all of these pictures from these Brazil productions, and the score sounded totally different than I'd imagined, right? So I've written about this show for years, right? It's a chapter in my book. I love it. I think it's so interesting. But I'd imagine the music sounding one way, I don't know, sounding like smoky cabaret, and it actually sounded like big band Hollywood music hall kind of. And it was this really sort of emotional, intense moment for me of finally hearing this show that I'd worked about and having this sort of glimpse of what this show was. And I think what's hard about theater history is it's gone. Like, you can't save a theater performance. You never know what it's like to have been in the room when that show was performed. And so it was really amazing to hear the music, and it just brought it all to life. I may have cried a little. And my next project is on military theater, actually, really different. So the Les Kurbas and the Brazil, we're talking experimental, avant-garde, really high quality, really good. People write about it, right? So now I'm looking at military theater, which is much more kind kind of propagandistic, right? Much more academic, much more not really about experimenting, right? Because it's theater by the army, for the army, to support the troops. The Soviet Union, their kind of army entertainment was professional theaters, paid for, supported, financed by the Ministry of Defense, not the Ministry of Culture, in many of the military districts. And the theater I'm looking at is the theater of the Subcarpathian Military District, and it's actually the largest military district in Soviet Ukraine, one of the largest in the Union, and the one that's right on the border of the Soviet Union itself. So I'm calling it theater on the front lines of socialism, and they had this professional theater that traveled to Budapest and Prague. They traveled to Afghanistan in 1984. So wherever the troops went, the theater went, performing these sort of melodramas about World War II, basically, and kind of retelling war stories, and retelling the story of the war, and sort of reinscribing what heroism is, what a hero is, what sacrifice is, right? What war is all about. And the theater, actually, the building still exists. It's still a theater. Obviously, it's not operated and financed by the Ukrainian army, but it is now financed by City Council in Lviv, and it's run by some amazing people, including some amazing young women who are like just 30 years old and doing really interesting stories that are important now with a war going on in Ukraine, right? And with kind of shifting politics and shifting social tensions and transformations, right? They're doing stories that speak to contemporary society. So I think this theater is really interesting, sort of how it's changed over time. I think this idea of war stories is really interesting, and how we tell war. And doing this project means I get to go to the city of Lviv, and actually just heard last week I got a Fulbright grant to Ukraine to do this research, so that's super exciting. I'm also really interested in actresses. I realized in this book there's very few women, which is funny because I was an actress, so I don't know what that's about. In this period that I write about in my first book, of Les Kurbas and the Berezil, and Ukrainian modernism and Ukrainian experimental art, obviously there were a ton of women there. Obviously there were a lot of actresses, but they're really not studied a lot. There's been some work kind of recently on this, but I think there's still actually a lot to be examined about what I sort of call the conservatism of the avant-garde, and sort of the ways that we see very traditional gender structures and stereotypes, actually, even in a sort of an experimental art scene. So kind of interested in playing with those ideas. And I guess I would say theater too, we might think of it as something expensive, elitist, and boring, right? I actually don't go to the theater a lot anymore, unless I'm in Ukraine and I'm doing it for work. But I actually think it's a really important lens on the past. I mean, theater used to be popular culture, right? It was Netflix, right? Binge watching Henry VI, right? Parts 1, 2, and 3. And so I think actually if you think about theater as the stories we tell, and you think about it as the stories a society tells about itself to itself, actually theater tells us a lot about worldview, and it tells us a lot about culture, and it tells us a lot about a society and a people. And so I think it's actually a really important lens on the past, right? When theater was this really important popular culture, popular entertainment, it actually offers us this kind of photograph or lens on a society, what a society values, the stories a society tells. So I think it's really important historically, and certainly important in my work. And I think too, even though I don't go to the theater a lot, I think it's really important today because it is a space where you have to be with other people, right? You have to sit with other people, you have to deal with actors on the stage. You are all stuck in a room breathing the same air. And we do that so rarely, right, in our society. And it kind of makes you be in the here, right, for something that is not going to last, right? It is totally ephemeral, and it vanishes even as it happens. And I think that kind of putting yourself in a room with other people and listening to these stories together is actually sort of a radical act in the modern world today, and I think really important. So I think schools should have theater. I think communities should have theater. I think doing theater is really important, and I think going to the theater is really important. And I think it's also about listening. Actually, I think, much as when I sort of think about actors as sort of always talking about themselves or something, but actually good acting is about good listening and really being hyper aware of what your partners on stage are doing, where they're moving, how they're speaking, and really hyper aware of the audience, right? And what the audience is sort of reacting to. Do you take longer with that joke? Do you sort of move more quickly through a scene, right? How are they sort of receiving the story that you're telling? And I think that kind of quality of listening and that quality of being in the here is really missing in our world today, and I think it's something that theater can give. I think there is this sort of large history of an anti-theatrical prejudice. There's a book by Jonas Barish called The Anti-Theatrical Prejudice, really going back to Plato in the cave and sort of the fake images, right, and it's not authentic. And certainly that has been an accusation leveled at actors, right, since time immemorial, that you are lying, right, you are putting on a mask. And I think actually, and I'm sure many people who've been on stage and done acting would agree with me, that actually on stage you are laid bare, and actually you're in a way more truthful, right, than you are in real life. And I think we do move around in our lives with masks, right, playing different characters, to my students, to my colleagues, to my friends. We always have masks, and there's something about being on stage and being in that moment and having to tell this story that actually makes you be 100% authentic, right? And so that actually is often taking off a mask as opposed to putting it on. And in a way, you're never more vulnerable than when you're on stage, right? And in a way, never more open than when you're performing on a stage.